There have been many Oddworld games released in the Oddworld franchise, some of which a lot of people may not have even heard of, so I thought it'd be a good idea to go through all of them and give a brief overview of their stories. Let's start right at the beginning. Oddworld Inhabitants was founded 30 years ago this year, in 1994, by Lorne Lanning and Sherry McKenna, establishing a game company that would set to work producing what is the first and probably most well-known game in the franchise, Oddworld Abe's Oddysee. Released in 1997 on the PlayStation 1, it told the story of a Mudokon slave called Abe, a blissfully unaware worker at Rupture Farms, the biggest meat processing plant on Oddworld. He stumbles upon a plan by the plant's boss to use the factory's Mudokon slaves as the newest tasty product to sell. Naturally, Abe doesn't hang around for this to happen to him, and makes a great escape out of the place. On this journey, Abe discovers that he's actually the chosen one of his species, destined to set them free from their servitude by the industrial forces. After spending time in the natural areas of Oddworld, he gains great mystical powers and returns once more to Rupture Farms. The game ended up being a massive hit, with Lorne Lanning crediting this, at least to some degree, to every other game developer missing the Christmas deadline that year, meaning it was one of the few major games out in time to be sold for Christmas. But it was also because the game was very good, being really well received with mostly positive reviews from critics, and winning awards. To this day, it's probably the most iconic game, considering I've known of people not knowing Oddworld, yet they still know the name Abe's Oddysee. Abe's Oddysee is what some people unfamiliar with Oddworld casually refer to the entire franchise as, I've noticed. But most importantly for the company that published the developer's game, GT Interactive, it was very commercially successful, selling in excess of 1 million units within a few months, and unexpectedly selling even better in Europe than it did in its native United States. Unfortunately, this turned out to be one of those gifts that's also a curse for Oddworld Inhabitants, as now being known for having had the Christmas hit of 1997, pressure was put on them to make a new game in time for the next Christmas. This was quite a spanner in the works for the developers' plans. Oddworld was initially envisioned as a 5-part series, known as the Oddworld Quintology, with Abe's Oddysee being the first installment. They didn't want to have to rush out the next part of that planned story so quickly, and that's even if they could. Abe's Oddysee had taken over 3 years to develop, and now their publisher was telling them to get the next one out within a year. As a result, they ended up instead doing somewhat of a compromise. They wouldn't do the next part of the main series as their next game, but would quickly produce a bonus game on the same engine to keep the publishers happy. And they did it in just 9 months. This is more impressive when you consider the resultant game, 1998's Oddworld Abe's Exoddus, also on the PlayStation 1, was so much bigger than Oddysee it had to be played on 2 discs. Abe's Exoddus picks up directly where Abe's Oddysee left off, with the spirits of dead Mudokons coming to Abe to inform him of the Gluckon's desecration of their ancient burial grounds. They're not just doing this to be disrespectful though, they're doing it to gather an ingredient for their addictive Soulstorm brew, an alcoholic beverage that makes their Mudokon slaves addicted and consequently dependent on their masters. First they wanted their flesh for food, now they want their bones for brew. So to sum it up, Abe sets off to shut down this mining operation before going on to take down Soulstorm Brewery and stop the production of the drink for good. Exoddus likewise had a strong commercial performance, and although Abe's Oddysee is probably still the most recognisable name in the franchise, Exoddus actually got even better reviews than its predecessor, and it's no wonder why. It's basically Abe's Oddysee, an already very well received game, but where the developers fixed any problems and took on and sorted any criticisms that were said about the first game. This is reflected by the fact that Abe's Exoddus would generally be considered as the best Oddworld game among Oddworld fans, topping every favourite Oddworld game poll that I saw by a long shot. This is all very ironic considering Lorne Lanning would generally call it his least favourite, but this is understandable when you consider the pressure they were under when making this game, with him saying, "We killed ourselves getting Abe's Exoddus done in 9 months, it was brutal." Not to mention he'd naturally wanted to continue his main series, so obviously disliked the fact that he was forced to make a detour. But now he was free to continue. But before we get onto that, in the same year Exoddus was released, so was Oddworld Adventures, a game that is hardly mentioned when talking about this series. Understandably, to be fair, as it was basically a severely shortened handheld version of Abe's Oddysee developed by American company Sapphire on the Game Boy. The plot of this one begins at the end of the Abe's Moon cutscene with the whole escaping Rupture Farms bit cut out entirely, seemingly indicating that Abe starts out as a native Mudokon in this one. 2 years later, in 2000, a sequel by the same company, Oddworld Adventures 2, was released for the Game Boy Color, and was naturally a handheld version of Abe's Exoddus. Unlike its predecessor though, Oddworld Adventures 2 actually did a pretty good job of replicating the game it was based on, with one reviewer noting that nothing was left out of this port, and it got reasonably good reviews. This was the same year that Oddworld Inhabitants had intended to release the next game in the Oddworld quintology, Munch's Oddysee, on the PlayStation 2, while also working on a game known as Hand of Odd, which is generally cited as being a real-time strategy game, although it's a bit more complicated than that. This ended up being one of the many unreleased Oddworld games, and consequently I shall mention them for comprehensiveness, though I won't go into too much detail when it comes to these because they were unreleased, and I already have a nearly complete entire series of videos specifically dedicated to each one of them. This also seems like the pertinent time to mention that prior to work on Munch's Oddysee, there had been talk from a developer that worked at Oddworld Inhabitants about repackaging Abe's Oddysee and Abe's Exoddus together along with a new bonus game called Soulstorm, but this was seemingly never something that seriously had a chance of happening. Back to Munch's Oddysee though, development on the second game in the quintology was rocky, and they ended up switching platforms. Oddworld Munch's Oddysee would instead be released in 2001, a year later than expected, as an exclusive launch title for the Xbox. The new publisher, Microsoft, had wanted to market the game to casuals and suggested changing the title to Abe and Munch's Fun Adventures. Oddworld Inhabitants said no. The first game in the series to have 3D gameplay, it told the story of Munch, the last member of the fished-to-death amphibious gabbit species, who gets captured by evil scientists known as the Vikers. The game sees him escape and unite with Abe, who work together to acquire the last can of Gabbia, the eggs of Munch's species that are considered a delicacy to the industrialists. Meanwhile, they're also saving more of Abe's species from captivity. It's worth pointing out though that much of the originally intended story had to be cut out and reworked during the transition from PS2 to Xbox. What was intended as the second part of the Oddworld quintology actually ended up being the last, at least of the original quintology. While respective reviews of the game are generally mixed to negative, with some considering it to be the worst Oddworld game, contemporary reviews were actually pretty decent. Despite this, and most importantly however, it was considered a commercial disappointment, thought to be largely due to Microsoft not promoting the game in Europe, where the series had previously sold the strongest. 2 years later, a Game Boy Advance version that wasn't that well received was released. Unlike the previous handheld versions, this game dramatically changed the story pretty much completely, instead featuring Abe and Munch together in the natural world from the beginning, and having to go stop a random Gluckin business as corrupting a native area. In this respect, it's so separate, it feels more like a standalone sequel than a port, I'd say. Due to the poor sales because of Munch's Oddysee, Oddworld Inhabitants were prompted to put their plans on hold. Their next intended steps had been to create another bonus game, Oddworld Munch's Exoddus, while waiting for the technology to improve to match with their ambitions for the third game in the quintology series, Oddworld Squeak's Oddysee. There was a long-standing rumour that the fourth game in the quintology was already known and was going to be called Oddworld Nod's Oddysee, but this has proven to be false. Instead of continuing with these plans, Oddworld Inhabitants decided to go in a different direction for their next game, instead making a standalone title that was unconnected to the previous releases. They also wanted to make sure that Microsoft wouldn't fail to promote their game again, so they switched publishers from Microsoft to EA Games. Challenge everything. After what would be the longest gap between two of their games up to that point, Oddworld Stranger's Wrath was released on Xbox in 2005, completely changing genres to action-adventure with first-person and third-person gameplay. Stranger's Wrath was inspired by westerns and featured a nameless bounty hunter collecting bounties to get enough money to afford an operation by a Vicar doctor that he feels he needs in order to survive. Stranger's Wrath was very well received by critics, and retrospectively is considered one of the best Oddworld games ever made. However, a bit of deja vu, Stranger's Wrath, despite incredible reviews, was a massive commercial failure, because according to Lorne Lanning, EA had failed to market it. The game needed to sell 1.6 million units just to break even, and only ended up selling 600,000. Despite this, Oddworld Inhabitants began work on what the next game would be, briefly considering a Stranger's Wrath 2 or a multiplayer version known as Stranger Arena, before settling yet again on a similar but standalone game, The Brutal Ballad of Fangus Clot. Work began on this project, however it was cancelled shortly after due to disagreements between Oddworld Inhabitants and the publisher they had lined up for the game, Majesco Entertainment. After this, there wasn't another Oddworld game for many years, with Oddworld Inhabitants shutting its doors in April 2005. Although this is a story for another time, I'm just talking about the games in this video. It wasn't until Oddworld Inhabitants made a deal with UK game developer Just Add Water that Oddworld games began being produced again, the first new project of which releasing in 2011 with a HD remaster of Oddworld Stranger's Wrath on the PlayStation 3 that ended up selling vastly more than the original did. This was with Oddworld Inhabitants going fully independent with publishing it themselves, suggesting Lanning was correct that it failed initially due to EA not marketing it. In 2012, Oddworld Munch's Oddysee HD, also for PS3, was then released. During this period, Lorne Lanning also spoke about working on a game called Oddworld Slave Circus, but this didn't end up happening as of yet. While the previous two had merely been remasters of their respective games, they had provided the funding for the next big project, which would be a fully ground-up remake of the game that started it all, Oddworld Abe's Oddysee. This was reflected with it having a new title, Oddworld New and Tasty, when it was released in 2014 for PS4 and PS3, and then a year later on the Xbox One. The game naturally followed very closely to what it was based on, with very minor changes story-wise. For instance, in the original there were 99 Mudokons to save, in the remake there was 300. New and Tasty would get very positive reviews, and although many Oddworld fans consider it inferior to the original, it would sell very well. The natural step after remaking Abe's Oddysee was to remake Abe's Exoddus in the same way with the same resources. But New and Tasty sold so well, it provided them with the funding to do something a bit more ambitious than just another remake. As a result, in 2016, the next project was announced as Oddworld Soulstorm. Although inspired by Exoddus as a reimagining of that game's story, it would basically be an entirely brand new game and act as a direct sequel specifically to Oddworld New and Tasty, as well well as now being the second installment of the new Oddworld quintology, with New and Tasty now being the first. After an unexpectedly long development time of half a decade, Oddworld Soulstorm was finally released in 2021 for the PlayStation 4 and 5, with an Xbox Series X/S version coming out later that year. The game reportedly received mixed or average reviews from critics, though I suspect this is likely due to the game being known for having quite a lot of glitches and bugs on initial release that were later patched out, as the Xbox version, which was branded as the Enhanced Edition, received generally favourable reviews, more in line with the rest of the series. In May 2024, I did a poll asking what's your favourite Oddworld game, and Oddworld Soulstorm is actually winning it massively. I'm pretty sure this is the first poll I've ever seen where Abe's Exoddus hasn't run away with it, so it's nice to see that a game that had a lot of hard work put into it is being appreciated in spite of its rocky release. Since then, it's unknown what the future of Oddworld holds, with nothing being announced as of May 2024. It's all down to the money. So hopefully Soulstorm sold well enough to continue the Oddworld quintology.
Hello, follow me.